Okay, buckle up because this might be a bit of a long video. So Vampire the Masquerade is a tabletop role-playing game from the 1990s.
This is the world of darkness, and vampires exist in this world.
I was first introduced to Vampire the Masquerade from the Bloodlines video game that came out in like the early 2000s. Since then, as I've gotten into tabletop gaming, I've gotten to know the actual TTRPG, and I've also vaguely learned about Werewolf the Apocalypse, which is kind of like a sister game. There are a couple of those dealing with different various supernatural entities and also human hunters that for whatever reason decide to go after them and probably die. But anyway, I'm not really here to talk about the tabletop role-playing game. There's definitely going to be some definitions that I'm going to have to get into, and I have tried to record this a couple times because I do keep getting too into them. So I'm gonna try my best to summarize the whole story and kind of my thoughts and feelings. It's the month of darkness, which means October. There's been a lot of people posting Vampire the Masquerade stuff online, so it's just been kind of at the forefront of my mind lately. Before I get too into it, I do want to give a content warning. Vampire the Masquerade is a mature game. It deals with a lot of questions in regards to like consent, mental, emotional manipulation, various topics across the board dealing with vampires that just are for a more mature audience. I ask that you are aware of what you can and can't watch. I know people that have never played the Vampire the Masquerade game because of concerns towards content, and I completely respect that. Alright, okay, let's get into the comic. So this comic is broken up into arcs that follow two major groups. The first one is Cecily and Alejandra, and the other is the Anarchs. I'm going to be going back and forth kind of sporadically because the story itself tends to go back and forth sporadically. So just bear with me as I try my best to follow the actual storyline as it's presented and switch back and forth between the groups and try to explain some of the concepts of Vampire the Masquerade as we go along.
It's probably a lot for you to take in, so why don't you let me show you the ropes?
So the comic itself follows Cecily Bain, who is kind of like a vampire cop. She works for the prince of the Camarilla being sort of a secret government of vampires for vampires.
That's the Camarilla. They make a tidy business out of enforcing vampire laws.
The main intent and focus of the organization being to uphold the masquerade, which is in the name of the game, literally. It's basically the concept that humans can't know about vampires because they would try to kill them, cause a lot of problems.
Keep our secret, and you make things easier on all of us. We're living in the age of cell phone cameras. Cops ain't tolerated.
And so the Camarilla is a system of checks and balances to try to keep vampires safe and keep humans from knowing about them. Cecily could have a title, but instead she doesn't want to have anything owed to the prince. So she does have a territory, which is a big deal, and she does have the right to sire or embrace someone, which essentially means that she could create another vampire if she wanted to. But other than that, she is just a boot to the prince. She completes various goals and missions and tasks at the prince's behest, but doesn't really have any proper authority or title of her own. So the story starts straight up with Cecily working. She is taking out a loose end she is unaliving someone's girlfriend. I hate saying that, but I feel like YouTube will get mad at me, so. The woman's boyfriend is a vampire and he told her, which is obviously a big no-no in regards to the masquerade. So we see Cecily straight up murder someone in the first couple pages of the book. We then are introduced to Calder, who is a Tremere and on the council for the prince. Tremere, I fear, is the word that I'm going to have to define, and this is probably going to be a bit of a tangent. So buckle up while I talk for a minute about the inner workings of Vampire the Masquerade, or you can skip to this timestamp if you don't want to hear about clans. So clans in Vampire the Masquerade is the ties that a vampire has to its progenitor or the originator of its bloodline for vampires. So like a Tremere is kind of like a vampire or wizard. They're a pretty complex group to try to explain first and foremost, but they basically have access to blood sorcery, which is magic using their blood blood or the vitae. VTM uses vitae or vitae in place of blood. Cecily is from Clan Bruja, which is, they're kind of like the rebels with a cause. They're usually pretty counterculture to whatever authority is in charge of like a city. A lot of them are anarchs. Usually that's like their designated association, but no one clan is tied to either the Camarilla, Anarchs, or Sabbat. So they are essentially like the physically intimidating rowdy group, or one of them, because there are actually a couple different ones in Vampire the Masquerade. I'll mention more specifically the other clans as they pop up in the story, but there are other groups like Nosferatu, who are like Nosferatu, the vampire from the super old movie, or the movie coming out this year. I'm so excited for that movie, but that's not the point. Or Ventru, who are kind of like the businessmen. They crave power and authority above everything else.
I don't expect gratitude, but I do demand loyalty.
Anyway, I'm putting a pause in it here just so we can get back on track, but just something to keep in mind. Cecily meets up with Calder after completing the task. He's a Tremere and probably the closest thing kind of to a friend that Cecily has. It's kind of debatable if you can even really have friends in Vampire the Masquerade, but they do have a good rapport with one another and trust each other, at least to the extent that they tell each other personal information. After that, Cecily goes to meet her sister, who was her younger sister, but now is much older than Cecily physically is. Cecily has been a vampire for a while, and her sister is kind of her last human connection. They call them touchstones in Vampire the Masquerade on like your character sheet, but it basically means that it's a person, place, or thing that reminds them of their human life, or it keeps them grounded in the human world in order to basically have any humanity left. That's getting into concepts of the game. I'm here to talk about the comic. I'll compare them kind of at the end of the video. So Cecily does have the right to sire a new vampire, and she's been debating embracing her sister, which there's a lot of ups and downs to doing that, and she isn't sure what the appropriate action is. Before Cecily can really decide, like come to a final conclusion on what she wants to do though, she comes across Alejandra, who is a young vampire on the run. Cecily stops her because Alejandra's in her territory, but she comes to feel badly, or at least sympathetically, for the young girl, and Cecily ultimately lies and pretends to be Alejandra's sire in order for her to be welcome to Camarilla society within the Twin Cities. From here, the first major story arc is Cecily teaching Alejandra about vampire society, how to hunt, where to hunt, which is a big deal, as well as some of the safety precautions and things to keep in mind for vampires in VTM. The end of that specific story arc actually shows us that Alejandra is a vampire hunter, or was a vampire hunter before she was embraced. We don't learn anything else really about it until later, but that is something that kind of happens at the tail end of the first little arc. The next storyline introduces us to the Anarchs I mentioned earlier, existing within the Twin Cities. Anarchs are like a opposing side to the Camarilla. They still believe in the Masquerade. They do have similar checks and balances and roles in that a Baron is kind of like the Anarch version of a prince, but there's less formality and there's less expectations for kind of your station, leading to direct authority or respect. I'm sure some people treat it exactly like the Camarilla, but with a different coat of paint. This group of Anarchs is composed of Colleen, who is a thin blood, which is essentially a vampire with less ties to their direct lineage or line, which means that they have no access to vampiric abilities inherently, but also lack some of the weaknesses of vampires, like they may be able to go out in the sun or eat food, which is something that vampires in VTM can't usually do, at least not with any kind of ease. The other members of her coterie, which is essentially like in this case a found family unit, but could also be like work associates.
My God, they are fantastic.
Oh yeah, this is awful.
Are King Rat, who is a Nosferatu, Mitch, who is a gangrel, which is about as close as a vampire can get to a werewolf, and Prissy, who is, at least at time of introduction, safely assumed to be a toreador from her actual rose tattoo to her Southern Belle-esque aesthetic.
battle scars.
We follow this group as they go from wherever they were into the Twin Cities on a mission. Ultimately, their first little arc ends with them running into hunters. I also really like this section because it introduces the concept of the Sabbat and shovelheads, which is not a term that you need to worry about, but if you are interested in exploring Vampire the Masquerade as a game, you'll probably come across.
They're mostly mindless, bloodthirsty assholes. That's all you need to know for now, right?
So it's nice to see it mentioned somewhere in the comic. The storyline then picks up again with Cecily and Alejandra as they investigate the murder of a vampire who was meeting with a group of Nosferatu. In this investigation, we're reintroduced to ideas or introduced to new ideas in regards to the vampire system and how it works, as well as just kind of their health and well-being stuff. They need to sleep during the daytime or they might go crazy. It's really bad for vampires to stay awake for a prolonged period of time. In the tabletop game, you'd have to roll for it and blah blah blah, but in regards to this, Cecily specifically says to Alejandra as being really bad for their health and well-being. But this murder ultimately leads to another conflict where she fights humans who have augmented themselves with vampire pieces. They're essentially murdering vampires in order to gain things like their various skills and powers, which are called disciplines in VTM, but I don't need to get into that. This is also when disciplines themselves are kind of formally introduced, with Cecily specifying to Alejandra that she's really fast and really strong, and someday Alejandra, if she lives long enough, will be able to find out what powers she has access to. We are kind of actually introduced to one of Alejandra's abilities, which is a strength against mental manipulation, kind of like a mental fortitude ability. When talking to Calder, Cecily actually asked him to use his blood sorcery in order to try to gain a better idea of what clan Alejandra is, since that can make a big difference in the abilities that she would be able to unlock, or ultimately how she's able to kind of live her unlife within vampire society. It's at the tail end of this little storyline that we find out the next one, as comics do, and that is that the prince has been murdered. We're left there as we switch back to the Anarchs. There's a lot of back and forth in this comic in whose perspective it is, so bear with me. But we go back to the Anarchs to see what they're up to. And that is them being captured by the hunters. We're given a backstory for King Rat, which is great. He's probably one of my favorite characters in the comic, but I don't need to talk about that right now. But this culminates in them killing one and capturing the other of the hunters, and this kind of harkening back to Alejandra again, as King Rat finds a picture of her within the hunter's van or among their belongings. From here, a good portion of the story is Cecily and Alejandra investigating the prince's murder and eventually finding out that it was an inside job from within the prince's council, and are framed for that murder with a blood hunt, which is basically a murder edict for the vampire community issued against them. So that means that any vampire in the city is gonna want to take a literal bite out of her and try to gain some sort of power or boon from being able to take her and Alejandra down, especially because of her prior station and job in Kindred Society. Kindred is another name for vampire, and this, if I didn't mention that before, in Kindred Society, it makes sense that most people are going to have some sort of vendetta or desire for revenge against her, especially with the permission and benefits that come from taking someone out during a blood hunt. It's Calder who has sort of taken on a pseudo prince role that issues the blood hunt, as well as had initially framed Cecily for the murder. We switch back to the Anarchs again and just see that they've taken the woman that they've captured and are kind of just holding her hostage in order to investigate what the hunters are up to and try to plan their next move. This is when Prissy reveals herself and her clan. She's not Toreador, she's actually Ministry, which are sort of like religious cult of VTM. There's a lot more nuance and a lot more story to that specific group, but for all intents and purposes, you can think of her as kind of this religious extremist. Her main purpose in this specific comic, and they're snake-like. The Ministry's like a snake cult, but her main purpose in this storyline specifically is creating a ghoul out of the woman that they captured, which means that she feeds her some of her vitae in order to basically mentally manipulate and physically enhance the human that they captured. After fighting their way through the blood hunt, Cecily and Alejandra come to the retirement home or the apartment that Cecily's sister resides in and face off with Calder. This is less a physical fight and more so a debate of perspectives and political intrigue, with Cecily working out a way for them to survive and for Calder to call off the blood hunt. It's shortly after this that Cecily learns about Alejandra's background and her betrayal, or her perceived betrayal. Her and King Rat have a conversation on Alejandra and everything that's kind of been going on. Cecily's not sure if she really believes that Alejandra is out to betray her though, and so does try to engineer different ways to kind of test Alejandra's interests and where her loyalties lie. This includes like telling her a little bit about herself in hope that Alejandra will trust her. The next little arc sees Cecily out on a hunt, and we learn her hunting style, which looks like it's Scene Queen, at least to me, but we also are introduced to a hunter trying to kill Cecily, and we learn a bit about the hunter group that is trying to coordinate an attack on the vampires of the Twin Cities. Should also mention that the Anarch group has kind of disbanded, with many of them going in different ways, and Mitch, who is the gang girl, is actually the next perspective that we follow specifically. We see him living in the woods on his own. This is actually the first time in the comic that we see a werewolf. The story continues like this for a while, and I'm going to skip over a lot here because there is a lot of stuff that happens that I don't think I need to mention in this video, but it's giving you an idea about the hierarchy and structure of the Society of Vampire the Masquerade. They introduce a older Tremere who has a higher station than Calder coming in to kind of investigate the city, kind of the yay or nay in regards to if Calder can take on the mantle of Prince within the city. But a lot of stuff happens that I am skipping in the effort of time, since this is becoming kind of a long video. But ultimately, we are shown that the hunters are real. They're a real threat in the city towards the end of that little story arc. And we're also introduced a bit more to Thin Blood, specifically Thin Blood Alchemy, which is sort of their primary ability in Vampire the Masquerade, as we see that Colleen moved in with other Thin Bloods and is helping them develop Thin Blood Alchemy, which is basically potions or different things that they can ingest or inhale or things like that in order to gain abilities that they would not normally have access to, made out of literally random things, like the most random things, plus the vitae of the Thin Bloods. So similar to blood sorcery, but not quite. The last major storyline of what I would say is the main story of the comic is the assault on Elysium. Elysium it's like a safe zone for vampires within the city. A lot of events are held there, or meetings, or it's where the prince will meet with their council, that sort of thing. Cecily and the other remaining vampires from the prince's original council, so their primogens and some remaining other members, are ambushed in the Elysium and have to fight their way out. And this ends with most of them dying, except for like Cecily and Calder and a few other characters. Who does die is Alejandra. So Alejandra and Cecily have kind of an intervention, or a fight in which Alejandra tries to convince Cecily to use the hunters in order to gain power within the Camarilla, try to engineer it into a way that they can walk away with the upper hand. It becomes very clear that she's kind of become not corrupted, but twisted in her perspective from where she was into who she is now very, very quickly, first of all, but also into a vampire that craves power, station, and respect, something that is pretty common in Vampire the Masquerade, but feels really interesting from the character that she was to who she is now. This ultimately leads to Cecily diablerizing Alejandra, which just means that she eats her, which sounds so weird, but it's essentially the consumption of a vampire's soul. So it comes with great power, but cost of absorbing that other vampire's soul. In younger vampires, it can actually decrease their generation, but in this case, it is just Cecily gaining reputation by her ruthlessness of the consumption of her perceived sired vampire. But you do get a reference to the Pieta, which is this famous statue of Mary cradling Jesus in her arms, which is honestly the most wild thing. Like it just felt like like such a random reference, but it's a really well done piece of art, but it literally took me out. I don't know why. It was just so funny to me when I turned the page and it was there. So after what I would call the main story of the book, because it does take up most of the book, we actually progress, I don't know how long in time, a little further in time, to a point where Cecily has now become the prince. She's taken the title of prince. No one else could be trusted with it. And it's not uncommon for a vampire of the Camarilla from outside the city to come in and take that title from within another city, but it does make sense that they wouldn't want to do that. Regardless, much of the rest of the book is comprised of a story focused on the new prince and her council trying to establish an Elysium. That Elysium ends up being this property guarded by a local pack of werewolves, and because of that, tension turns to war, and it's all in all not a good situation for a new prince to be dealing with, and it's up to Cecily and specifically her Anarch friends and Calder, because that's who she knows she can trust at the time, to try to stop or resolve the werewolf situation, and it does get resolved. We see Cecily dealing with the repercussions of diablerizing Alejandra earlier in the book, with Alejandra actually communicating with her mentally and kind of driving her a little insane with her incessant talking to her and the control that Alejandra is trying to gain over Cecily. And it is a concept in Vampire the Masquerade that the soul of the diablerized person could take over the body of the vampire that diablerized them. We're seeing that kind of, I think, in the new Bloodlines 2, Fire having a thin blood imbued within her.
He's hiding something.
Although I don't know. The deal with Bloodlines 2 is legit confusing.
The game is scheduled for release the first half of 2025.
And I'm honestly trying not to think about it, especially because that's not what we're here to talk about. That video game though is wild. If you ever want to research a game that's totally in development, like not even death, like death and resurrection, you should look into that because it's been really interesting over the years to see them talk about it. This is so off tangent. Let's get back to the comic. So the story follows Cecily as she progresses from this like vampire cop, that's pretty much what she is, into a station of authority that she never wanted. We also see her kind of lose some of her humanity and her sense of who she was when taking on this station. She has a moment with Calder where she talks about how vampires need that touchstone, that person, place, or thing to tie them into the world, or they'll just lose themselves, lose their humanity. And I think that's really cool. That's kind of a fundamental idea of Vampire the Masquerade. But more or less, that's the story. I feel like my voice is so hoarse now. I've recorded this quite a few times to try to speak more precisely in what I'm talking about. With that, let's talk about what I liked and what I didn't like about Vampire the Masquerade, the complete series. Hi, future me coming in to re-record this part again because I just didn't like what I had scripted and I wanted to just kind of say my feelings instead. So I'm doing that. If this sounds different, that's why. I feel like this whole video has sounded very choppy, but whatever, that's not the point. To get what I like out of the way first, I really like the art of this comic. I think it's really solid and has like a cool grungy vibe that's just really fun and carries really well throughout the comic. It is a gory comic. There's a lot of stuff that I kind of skipped over in the description of the actual story itself, including kind of like a whole subplot with another character, just because a lot of panels and frames used on pages I can't really show on YouTube. It's nothing overly disgusting, but it is enough that I just don't think it's a good idea to put it in a YouTube video, if that makes sense. Additionally, I liked a lot of the writing for the characters. There's no characters that I particularly would say that I like. I guess I liked King Rat. He was probably my favorite character in general, although I am totally biased to Nosferatu. I also really like Cecily herself. She's a very sympathetic character. You kind of get the sense that she wants to be a better person than she is, which is commendable, I guess. They're all pretty compelling in their own way, although some of them are compelling in how much I don't like them, but that's nice. These are monsters and they are fueled by their desires, whims, and own self-interest at the end of the day, and I think that worked really well throughout the story. Additionally, I like how many concepts and ideas from Vampire the Masquerade it does kind of throw at you. It definitely seems like it would be a confusing book. This is probably a negative. It definitely seems like it would be a confusing book if you've never had any familiarity with Vampire the Masquerade or any of the World of Darkness franchise. I don't know how likely likely you are to even pick up the book in that case, since it is clearly a branded book. But if I didn't know anything and I tried to read the comic, I feel like it may be confusing. I tried to throw in a lot of definitions in this video just because maybe that would be useful to someone watching, but in general I don't know how new reader friendly this book would be necessarily. At the same time, someone may really enjoy the immersion of just being dropped into a world and expected to pick up definitions and ideas as you go along. I think that this is one series that kind of handles it well in the way that it introduces Alejandra, who is new to being a vampire but not new to the concepts of vampires within the world. But yeah, thoughts and feelings, I guess, summarized is that if you like Vampire the Masquerade, this might be a good narrative-based comic to check out that takes place within the greater world of the VTM universe, or whatever, however you would describe that.
This is the world of darkness.
But it may also not be super new reader friendly, or may not be a good jumping off point into Vampire the Masquerade, but I don't know. I have a huge soft spot for this franchise. I love monsters. I think it's really fun. And yeah, so I'm trying not to be too blinded by my own enjoyment of the world of darkness when talking about this comic. I also might sound like a Camarilla apologist. Don't come for me. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for checking it out. I'm surprised that you stuck around. This kind of turned into a super long video. I recorded probably about 45 minutes of recordings and then have been trying to whittle it down over the past week or so that I've had to edit this video. I've taken a long time to post and I apologize for that, but I do kind of make these videos in my free time between a full and part-time job and whatever else life throws at me. But anyway, regardless, thank you for checking it out. I have a lot of fun with VTM in the past, and I'm hoping to play it again in the future. I mean, it's October, so, you know, we'll see. Also, if you're just looking for a fun thing to do, there are quizzes. I think I put footage of it in the video. There are quizzes on the World of Darkness website, and they have a lot of free resources online if you ever want to totally rabbit hole into the World of Darkness universe. I think it's a lot of fun. But yeah, I'll link to the comic on Amazon and then the Paradox or World of Darkness website, all that good stuff. And let me know if you like Vampire the Masquerade. What clan is your favorite from the vampires, or whatever lichen you like. I don't know. What are they called? Lupines. Whatever lupine you like. I don't know. Now I'm just rambling, but thanks for checking out the video. Hopefully I will have it recorded and uploaded before November. So have a good night, YouTube.